It seems like EpoMaker has been on a mission the last couple of years to not only make some solid offerings for traditional, affordable keyboards, but also to make some truly interesting keyboards that aren't the same as everything else on the market. Well, I don't think that anyone could claim that this keyboard EpoMaker is launching on Kickstarter is not interesting. This is the Dynatab 75X with an 8.5-inch multifunction RGB LED screen and a compact 75% layout. Let's take a closer look at the Dynatab 75X. Before we dive in, I want to mention that EpoMaker sent me the Dynatab 75X for the purpose of reviewing it. They did ask me not to release this video prior to February 19th, 2024, because that is the date that it will be launching on Kickstarter and they'll be sharing all of the final details. I was not paid to make this video and EpoMaker has no input on my review. I also want to mention that because this is a pre-production unit, it may have slight differences from the final production run, and some of the details like all the available color options, those things aren't finalized as of the date I'm recording this, so be sure to check the Kickstarter campaign for all of the details. EpoMaker also told me the customization software for it, and possibly also the firmware, is still being optimized. I'll keep the description of this video updated with links to the Kickstarter campaign as well as EpoMaker's website so you can find the most current information available. Well, EpoMaker definitely gets credit for not making another boring 75% layout here. The Dynatab 75X has several interesting things going for it. And let's just get this out of the way. This is obviously not a keyboard for everyone. Not everyone wants a big LED screen on their keyboard, and I'm assuming this is why EpoMaker is launching this via Kickstarter rather than doing a big production run before gathering interest. So I'm not going to be reviewing this from the standpoint of, is this something everyone needs? Because no. I'm reviewing this mostly from the standpoint of assessing whether it's good at what it's trying to be. Something fun and different than a traditional keyboard that still also functions as a traditional keyboard. Now, EpoMaker sent me the 75X in what was labeled as the black and gray colorway with EpoMaker Wisteria tactile switches and cherry profile keycaps that have shine-through side legends. You can currently buy the Wisteria switches from EpoMaker in both a linear and a tactile version, but I'm not sure if those are the final switches that are going to be offered in the Dynatab 75X or not. Let's start by covering the features and specs that I know of as of the time I'm recording this, and then we'll talk about pros and cons based on my week of using the Dynatab 75X. The Dynatab 75X is a modified 75% layout keyboard with 84 keys and an ANSI layout. The LED screen is about 8.5 inches in width and features 540 RGB LEDs with several default modes to switch between, including date and time, battery level, system stats, and lighting effects, but it can also be customized with your own images or animations. The dimensions are 345 by 181 by 42 millimeters, and the weight is 1,110 grams or 2.44 pounds. Internal features include a polycarbonate switch plate, gasket mounting, IXPE switch pad, foam between the PCB and the plate, and a thick layer of foam beneath the PCB assembly. The PCB is hot swappable and compatible with 3 and 5 pin switches. Wireless connections include Bluetooth for 3 devices and 2.4 GHz. The connections are controlled by the switch in the top right corner of the keyboard. Backlighting aside from the screen itself includes south-facing full RGB that can be customized in the EpoMaker driver software. This pre-production sample also included shine-through side legend keycaps. The Dynatab 75X includes a 10,000 mAh battery, but the estimated battery life has not been published on EpoMaker's site yet. Customization is done via the EpoMaker driver software, which allows for remapping, adding macros, controlling wireless sleep timeout, as well as customizing the backlighting and the screen features. The Dynatab 75X will be launching on Kickstarter on February 19th, 2024, and I don't have the pricing information prior to the launch, so check the link in the description for the Kickstarter campaign to see the pricing information. Okay, now let's talk about some pros and cons that I've observed with the 75X over the past week, starting with the pros. First up, although it is all plastic, EpoMaker did a nice job on the construction here, and I think it feels a little bit nicer overall than the TH80 Pro, which I have tested previously. Speaking of the TH80 Pro, the sound profile of the Dynatab is also a bit nicer in my opinion. The TH80 Pro has a more hollow sound compared to the Dynatab, so they did a nice job with the internal sound dampening here. Now, it may not be the solid absorbed sound that you get with a dense all metal case, but it's still pretty satisfying overall. The connectivity options are also nice here with Bluetooth for 3 devices and 2.4 gigahertz. I didn't have any trouble with the wireless connections, and the screen actually gives you a confirmation message when you're connected. The button control here in the corner of the screen is also nice because you can cycle through the screen modes without having to remember a key command or sacrifice a key command that you wanted to program to do something else. And speaking of the screen, even if you don't plan to customize it with animations or your own images, it actually has both practical and aesthetic applications. One of the default options here is to display the date and time. You sync the date and time with your computer by going to the EpoMaker driver software options, and then the Dynatab will maintain that date and time. I actually like this option because it's a little extra RGB and it's big enough to actually look at it throughout the day versus the text on some of the tiny little screens that are on some other keyboards. But if the clock option isn't for you, there's several other default options to cycle through, and you can customize it with the driver software as well. Overall, I think if you like this feature, the screen itself, it's a pretty cool implementation of a screen on a keyboard. I like that they didn't go for something trying to be like high resolution, but instead went for a more retro dot matrix style because it matches well with the more retro aesthetic of the keyboard itself. Speaking of the software, while I personally prefer QMK firmware with VIA compatibility for customization, EpoMaker's driver software does offer remapping, adding your own macros, as well as customizing the lighting and, of course, the screen. You can also adjust the sleep timeout for the Bluetooth and 2.4 gigahertz connections. Now, with regard to the switches, I don't really want to put too much emphasis on this because I don't know if the Wisteria switches are going to be the ones that they ultimately put in the Dynatab for the main production run, but I do like these. I haven't tried the linear version of the Wisteria switches, but these tactile switches have a nice pronounced tactile bump. It's not quite as big and firm of a bump as like a Panda style switch, but it's definitely a sharper bump than a Brown switch. It's not that real soft rounded bump. They're smooth and the travel is a little shorter than a typical switch at 3.1 millimeters, so they feel very responsive and they're not scratchy either, so the factory loop seems to be pretty good. Now, before we talk about cons, I want to just mention a few things here for various reasons, sort of in between pros and cons. The first thing is just a small issue I had with a feature that I'm not really counting as a con because it falls into the category of things that EpoMaker is still working on optimizing before the full production run. And the issue is the operating system identification. Now, the manual indicates that the Dynatab 75X has a feature where it will recognize the operating system, Mac or Windows, automatically through the connection, and it will adjust your modifier keys just based on that. I haven't had that working correctly on the Dynatab 75X yet. However, there is actually a key command to switch between Mac and Windows, thankfully. It is Function A for Windows and Function M for Mac, and that worked perfectly for me while I was testing it. So if you do run into an issue with that and it wasn't just a pre-production issue, you do have key commands to swap between them. But I would assume that's something that they'll work out. Now, I'm also going to mention a few other things here before we talk about cons. First, something that's not really a pro or a con to me, and that's this modified 75% layout. This is like if you took a half step in the direction of a TKL layout or took an exploded 75% and added a partial nav cluster. You get the point. I don't really find this better or worse than a more traditional layout, so that's why I don't really see it as a pro or a con. You may disagree, but I haven't found any advantages or disadvantages. It's fine. Now, the next thing I'll mention in this sort of in-between category is these keycaps. There's nothing inherently wrong with these keycaps, and I actually think that the cherry profile makes sense here. My only input on this is just side legends are not for everybody. But again, I'm not sure if these are the keycaps they're going with, but if they do, it could be a pro for some people if you like them, or a con for other people if you don't like the side legends, so it kind of falls in between. Now, the last thing I'll mention in this sort of in-between space is the battery life, and really it's just because I don't know what the expected battery life is. It hasn't been published on EpoMaker's site as of the date I'm recording this. It might be in the Kickstarter campaign details, so check that out. But there are 2 battery cells here that add up to 10,000 milliamp hour, and normally that would mean really good battery life. But because one of the main draws here is the big, bright LED screen, most people are probably gonna wanna use the screen, and that could mean that even though you got a big battery capacity, it could mean just average life. But I don't know. I've used this for a week. I was able to use it about 4 days in a row in the wireless mode, so I haven't used it long enough to confirm or deny whether the battery life is going to be really good or just kind of average. All right, now let's talk about a couple of cons. First, the obvious one here, I will mention it, that if you don't love having a screen, like if you don't really see much of a use for a screen, it's pretty hard to ignore this one. On some keyboards that have, a tiny little, like a 1-inch screen, you can simply turn the screen off or set it to a clock or something like that, and then it's not really taking up a ton of your keyboard space, and you don't really have to look at it. But if you buy this and you don't love a screen, well, I'm assuming you're not gonna buy it to begin with, but if you did, then it's kind of hard to look past the screen on this if it's not your favorite thing. But assuming that you're buying this because of the screen, then that's not a con. In the area of subjectivity, a couple things that might be cons for you could be the sound profile. While I do think it's better than the TH80 Pro because it's less hollow sounding, less resonance, there isn't a real heavy weight in the bottom of this to absorb a lot of sound. So at least with the tactile switch option, it winds up being a kind of a high volume keyboard relative to some others on the market. So if you're looking for something that is quiet, you have a couple ways that you could get around that. You could do O-rings to try and soften the impact. You could also just try silent switches. EpoMaker makes a pretty nice silent switch, the Sea Salt silent switches. So if you're looking for more of a quiet profile, but this keyboard appeals to you, the sound profile, while I find to be fairly satisfying, it's definitely not a quiet keyboard. The only other thing that could be kind of a subjective con here for you is if you're buying it because it's more of a statement piece, like a real interesting thing on your desk that you like to interact with on a daily basis, it would be cool if they had gone with like a metal case or even just a metal top on it. I think it'd be a little bit more of a statement piece if it was all metal and like really nice and solid. Of course, that would make it more expensive. Other than that, I don't really have anything objectively wrong or bad about the Dynatab 75X because this is, for a niche segment of the market. If you're shopping for a truly traditional keyboard, you're probably not going for this one. So assuming that you're going into this because it's unique, I'm not really finding objective issues with it other than what I mentioned. Now, when it comes to price, I can't comment on that because it hasn't been announced as of the time I'm recording this. You will be seeing what the price is on the Kickstarter campaign if you go check it out. I did hear a mention from CES that it might be in the range of $150. If that is the actual price, I think it would be mostly fitting of a keyboard with these features. Slightly less than that, I think would be a pretty good value. More than that, I think would be a little overpriced considering, it is still an all plastic keyboard. So what do you think of the Dynatab 75X? Let me know down in the comments, and if you do end up getting one, let me know how you're liking it. This was a fun one to test out and review, so thank you to EpoMaker for sending one to me to check out. If you're interested in the Dynatab 75X, check out the description for links to the Kickstarter campaign, and I'll also update that with links to EpoMaker's site if they eventually move it right onto their site for you to purchase there. Also, a future disclaimer, if it does become available directly through EpoMaker's site, that will be an affiliate link. The Kickstarter campaign will not be an affiliate link. Don't forget to subscribe to the Semi-Pro Tech and Gear channel before you leave, and hey, why don't you check out this video here in the corner? I'm sure you'll like it. Thanks everybody, see you next time.